there's a huge overlap between dyslexia, ADHD, the different neurodiverse conditions you mentioned, dyspraxia, autism. And so I wonder to what extent that, you know, we could play around with stats, whether it's 4%, 10%, but I think it's our duty to all be familiar with the different characteristics so that we're already creating a curious and compassionate society.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Karen.
Thank you. Lovely to be here, Jo. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. So firstly, I guess, you know, we talk a lot in Human Givens, don't we, about abstract language and nominalizations. And, you know, I think it's really helpful if we all start off perhaps with a shared understanding of neurodiversity and what that actually means. So is that something that you're able to unpack for us?
Yes. So it's a big term, and how it's understood by everyone can really vary. Often I use quite a practical example to share what neurodiversity is, because how do we explain it? On one level, the neurodiversity is that we think differently, that mental activity of thought that's going on in our lovely minds varies, and that some of us are more visually oriented, some think in words. So how we think in our heads and how we process information around us in our environment is individual and varies from person to person. And one way, this practical example or way of illustrating that, is to imagine a group of people around a table, let's say 5 or 6 people, and I were to give each of them a box of Lego. And that box of Lego has a model, whether it's a car or a building. And I ask each participant to, in their own time, get going with making that Lego piece. And how each person approaches making that Lego will demonstrate neurodiversity in front of our eyes. One person will carefully open the box, get out the instructions, sort out the pieces, and make that model in a very linear, sequential way, perhaps following the verbal instructions. Someone else, because those instructions are verbal and pictorial, may follow the pictorial instructions going and following it in a linear sequential way. Someone else might rip open that box, look at the picture, look at the pieces, and just use the big picture to guide how they make it. They have an intuitive sense of how the pieces work together. Someone else might look at that and think, I'm not following any of that. I'm going to be a master builder and make it my own way. So there you have neurodiversity at play, how we process the information and how our mental activity guides our response to that task. So that was an example, I think, without using too many words, I hope.
What a fantastic example. What an absolute wonderful explanation. So really, it's our own unique way of processing and of understanding and interacting in the world around us. And I think under that very broad umbrella term, we hear diagnoses such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADHD, etc. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about those individual diagnoses?
So what you said earlier, which was interesting, was this word nominalization. And I'm not sure that all our listeners may know that word, because nominalization is a way of saying we have big ideas that have a name. Words like, control, love, peace, Brexit, all these things are subjectively defined. We don't explain what each of them means. So it's interesting how often we have words and we're left to create our own interpretation and picture of what they mean. And if we look at some of those neurodiverse conditions, that is playing a part there. If we look at dyscalculia, for an example, dyscalculia is getting more acknowledgement, which is someone's ability to calculate and process mathematical ideas. And this is actually a really broad term, but some of it can be linked to normalizations, the abstract nature of maths. So is it someone's ability to calculate quantities, or is it their ability to interpret the symbols that we use in our mathematical language? So when I've worked with people with dyscalculia, a lot of our work is helping them create pictures for these abstract symbols like the addition symbol or the division symbol. So some of us intuitively know that they stand for dividing quantities into groups. We know multiplication is very abstract. So children with dyslexia or dyscalculia will find rote learning of times tables too abstract and will need to learn it in a more visual sensory way, because times tables is shorthand for counting in groups. So often when we have things like dyscalculia, it's suggesting more the input by the environment, how it's taught or how it's communicated using mathematical language, is out of sync with how the person's natural ability to process it. And so how do we align the input with how they process it? And often in our educational system, for example, there's lots of symbols, and we're presenting it verbally to people who process their learning style is more by seeing and doing. And that's the same with dyslexia. If you think about language, what's very common among some of the dyslexic people I've worked with is that they can express themselves verbally really well, but writing, then capturing their thoughts in writing, is really difficult, because it's a whole different set of skills. Because when we write things down, we have to create a sequence in which we're telling the story. We have to, and so it's like translating. When you're verbally telling a story, the dyslexic brain often is more visually oriented and has this wonderful picture and images that they're telling. But when you're writing that down, you have to capture those images and you're translating them into a sequence of words. So a whole different set of skills comes into play, which is why it's so interesting that dyslexic people often are better with their verbal skills than their written skills. And language is again very abstract. So let's say people with dyslexia are reading words, and when you think of it, a word like dinosaur or train brings up a lovely picture, but more than 60% of words are non-visual. Words like until, beyond, and, a. Think of all the words, and that's why dyslexic children often you'll see struggling with very simple words, and that's because of this cognitive style out of sync with our dominant language style. So it's nothing to do with intelligence, funnily enough. There is, I think, a lot going on cognitively, and that we need greater awareness and understanding around that.
And I think, we seem to have seen a widespread uptick in various diagnoses, and there might be a number of different reasons for that, which we can have a look at, a little bit later on. But how common actually is this broad umbrella term of neurodiversity? Do we have any figures of what percentage of the population might now be considered to be neurodiverse?
Well, I suspect it's far bigger than we think, but typically in the UK and the US, we would use the figures about 1 in 10 people is dyslexic. And I think most recently in the podcast in the UK, that we think about 4% of the population have ADHD, and yet only 1% so far are diagnosed or in the process of diagnosis. So however much we hear talk about ADHD and the uptick in ADHD, it's still very underdiagnosed, arguably, against this 4% of the population that are expected to be presenting with ADHD. There's a huge overlap between dyslexia, ADHD, the different neurodiverse conditions. You mentioned dyspraxia, autism. And so I wonder to what extent that, we could play around with stats, whether it's 4%, 10%, but I think it's our duty to all be familiar with the different characteristics, so that we're already creating a curious and compassionate society for anyone, that it's wider spread than we realize, and that by having an understanding of the characteristics, we are more in tune with people, that we understand everyone's experience and don't just come to it from our own view, our own lens of the world and how we think, that we are open to the idea that people think differently and perceive things differently. And that neurodiversity, when you ask me to define that, is so essential in any society, because if you look at well-known people, Richard Branson is out there promoting his dyslexia, as is Jamie Oliver. We've had famous dyslexic architects and artists, comedians are coming out with their ADHD experience. And what it's suggesting is that their way of thinking, their visual spatial ability, their lateral thinking is we play to our strengths. That's demonstrated in the professions that they seek. Richard Branson says, I'm a picture thinker. My ability to see the big picture is what makes me the entrepreneur that I am, and that I have to surround myself with people who think differently, to whom I can delegate the number crunching and the project management skills. Because with that neurodiverse style, the ADHD style, for example, and the dyslexic style, comes the big picture, It's interesting that City University did research that showed that among business people, 40% are dyslexic. So a far higher incidence of dyslexia among entrepreneurial business people than in the general population. Far higher percentage of people with dyslexia in careers like architecture. Far higher incidence of ADHD among comedians if we were to do that research. I don't think that's happened. And so, demonstrating people playing to their strengths.
Absolutely. It's really interesting because one of the most structurally and strategically brilliant managers I've ever worked with was absolutely neurodiverse. And it was her neurodiversity, her dyslexia, and the way that her brain worked that allowed her to manage this very large team of people in such a creative but cohesive way. And it was just interesting watching how those processes worked within that department in ways that, blew most of our minds, because we just wouldn't have thought like that. And I think it's, I'm really interested to hear, you've talked to us so beautifully about dyscalculia, dyslexia. What other characteristics might we see in ADHD, for example?
So things that, so let's look at some of them. Typical one would be, let's say, time blindness. So it's a typical experience for people with ADHD and indeed with dyslexia to not have an intuitive sense of time in terms of 24 hours, measuring time and being able to manage your time and transition from one activity to another. Often for people with ADHD, it's now or not now. And this can make life very difficult. So I'm going to do it now, I'm thinking of it, I'm doing it now. And if I don't do it now, I don't intuitively allocate the thing I need to do to another time. So it might get overlooked. I might just not do it. So that can be very challenging, you can imagine, when things are either now or not now. So there is no sense of time often. And so that has to be, in a way, learned or to develop an understanding of time. And that can lead into time management issues and organizational skills problems, just to name. Another one is something we call object permanence. So I need to see it. If something out of sight, out of mind. And so I had one lovely lady with ADHD saying, I do shopping, my fridge is full of food. But when I'm hungry and I've finished my day at work, I'm sitting at my desk at home, and I don't remember what I have in my fridge. I might do a takeout because for me, I don't remember what's in my fridge. And it's just out of sight, out of mind. That's another lady told me how she struggled at work because her manager wanted this tidy desk policy. She needs everything out. If I don't see it, I don't do it. And funnily enough, as part of my coaching and counselling, it's very much to support people, neurodiverse people, to create a visual environment. Most of my clients have whiteboards somewhere in their room for them, and to share information with their spouse, that at least there's somewhere a visual reminder. Parents, I have to share with parents, don't tell your children what to do, write it down for them or draw it out, storyboarding. We have to get in the habit of writing things out, drawing things out, have paper and pens on every table in every room in the house just to facilitate that. So out of sight, out of mind is something. Time blindness is another characteristic. Gosh, there's a huge number of characteristics. So those are some of the more practical ones. Sometimes for people with dyslexia and ADHD, one can have the big picture. So one can imagine a project or where one wants to go. I'm here, and this is where the outcome, the holiday that I want to have. But it's very hard then to picture. What doesn't come intuitively is thinking in a linear sequential way and thinking about how to manage the steps to get from here to there. So that's very hard. Another defining characteristic is taking up hobbies and dropping them very quickly, because if we look specifically at the ADHD brain, it's often described very much as seeking stimulation. Our lovely brains are always seeking stimulation, but there is a biological explanation as well with ADHD, with the mechanism of dopamine seeking, and therefore being very easily distracted because looking for ready gratification with a dopamine hit and seeking dopamine hits of dopamine, through going onto TikTok and getting quick releases, or through an online shop, or these distractible activities that easily then grab our attention, and then where we might overlook the things we have to do.
It was interesting. I was staying with some friends in Cornwall a few weeks ago, and their son has a diagnosis of ADHD, And he's, you know, he's the sweetest, most well-behaved, lovely little boy who has intense interest in things. So when I was down there, he'd got some giant ants, and he could tell you literally everything about these giant ants and about all of the different species and things, all the different breeds of giant ants. And sort of interacting with him and watching how his processes worked in terms of his focus, and that being able to intensely focus for a period of time and then not being able to focus at all. And so things within his home environment that he was very, very interested in contrast to how he was experiencing things at school in an environment that perhaps isn't necessarily set up the way that his brain design is. And so that kind of falls into what we might say in human givens, is that, you know, the environment him is for his brain design is sick, because the teaching styles, there's no criticism of the school, but the teaching styles are just not in tune with the way his brain is designed. So he would be intensely focusing at school to really try and get something, and then this overwhelm. And we recorded a podcast a couple of months ago now with Jane Timmins, and she was also talking on that podcast about ADHD, and she said what they think is happening, and I'm sure you know this, is that, you know, when we're focusing, when we're in that focused state of attention, we have a chemical release in our brain as we're focusing intently, and that builds up to the point of collapse. And once we've reached that limit, it floods, and that's when the focus then drops out, which I thought was such a useful way of understanding what's happening in the ADHD brain. Is that?
And to your point, I think that's so lovely. And to your point, I think the label is really unhelpful. And so often I suggest to people, ADHD, we should drop the D for disorder. It's not a disorder. It is a difference in how we direct our attention. And you described that, the little boy loved it beautifully. It's not a deficit of attention. It's how we direct it. So everyone with ADHD can bring a wonderful hyper focus to things that interest them. But that beautiful brain is easily bored. So if I can't engage with something because it's too auditory, and I learn by seeing and doing, but something is just too verbal, the teacher's just standing and talking, or at a workplace, it's all too auditory and I'm not getting my need for stimulation, and, you know, then I do switch off, I'm seeking distraction elsewhere, or I might daydream or zone out, because engaging with my own thoughts is more interesting than trying to process all the talk. So it's really about direction of attention rather than a deficit of attention. And it's interesting that another characteristic, therefore, may be low boredom thresholds. And it was so interesting. I was working with a little boy and I could see his eyes glaze over, and I've said to him, I'm boring you, aren't I? And he said, yes. I said, I realize I'm talking to you too much. He said, yes. So we had to, you know, we have to be super creative. So within education, particularly, the educational establishment, teachers do need to know about this, and teachers have a tremendously challenging job, and yet I'm suggesting that they need to know more about neurodiversity and how to present the curriculum in a way that meets the needs of the different learning styles. And sadly, this is hardly covered in teacher training even today. Very little time is allocated to understanding how people learn and what neurodiversity is, actually.
Absolutely. I know, you know, many years ago, my brother, when he was at school, my brother has a diagnosis of dyslexia, as has one of my daughters, actually, but he was taken out of lessons that he was good at and given precision teaching in exactly the same way that wasn't working for him in the classroom. And so it felt like a bit of a punishment, really, that he was taking him out of PE or whatever it was, because he needed to do this, you know, learn maths in this very linear way. And that, I think, you know, and I witnessed that, you know, at an early education with my daughter as well. As she's got older, though, she's developed her own techniques and ways of doing things. And I love how visual, you know, the way that you work is. And when she did all of her revision notes and any written work that she has to do for when she did her GCSEs last year, everything is so beautifully decorated. She's got flowers, she's got bees, she's drawn all of that. And the teachers say, we love it when you hand in your homework, because it always looks so beautiful. But that, for her, really helped her to be able to remember things, to have those visual representations that were meaningful for her, but not necessarily anybody else. And I think there's a real mirroring of what you said there about being aware of how the unique fingerprint of how somebody's brain design is really for teachers, as far as reasonably practical, but certainly for therapists to get into the model of reality of that person. From a given perspective, we're talking about model of reality, aren't we? And I think, that's desperately challenging for, teachers with, so many children in a class to be able to do that. But maybe we're in a time where we need to be more creative with our teaching for everybody than that linear way.
Yes, and well, now you prompt me to think of something else, in as much as that it's said that neurodiverse children by the age of 12, research has shown, and I can't cite where, but it was in another podcast on ADHD I watched last week, a webinar, in fact, saying that children by the age of 12 who are not neurodiverse have something like 20,000 more negative interactions than their peers because of this, from their parents, well-meaning parents and educators, in relation to, oh, you're lazy, or why aren't you doing this? Because we have an expectation. And so for us as counselors or as educators, we don't have to be experts in neurodiversity, because it's a huge field. We could spend this podcast just talking about ADHD, actually, separate to dyslexia. Then, of course, most people I work with ADHD, I've noticed now huge overlap with autism. So, and we touched on dyspraxia. We haven't explained it. There's dyscalculia. So we don't have to be experts. I think we need to be curious and have an understanding of loosely the characteristics that people may experience. So, that it's a different, and know that people have a different cognitive profile, and be curious about the person in front of you and notice, tell me what you're good at, what comes to you intuitively. We all have this profile of things that come intuitively, and we notice the things that we find difficult. And so to be more interested in the profile, we don't need to label or diagnose, but we do need to help people realize themselves, I notice I'm really good at this, and I notice that this is hard for me. And this fits in with the emotional needs model, in as much as behavior is emotionally driven. And I love the human givens model, where we look at how are our needs met, and we all have an innate need for achievement, just to give an example. And so we need to notice how we meet that need for, we need that need for achievement met. Now, a lot of my clients with ADHD are self-employed because they're very creative and find it hard to work in a business. They find it hard to fulfill the administrative expectations of working in a company. They're naturally entrepreneurial, naturally creative, so they're working for themselves. But as self-employed people, they find it very hard to create structure. And because they're big thinkers, they might procrastinate and find it hard to do those small things for their business. And now they're not getting their need for achievement met as self-employed. So I've worked a lot with self-employed people with ADHD who are actually feeling quite low and feeling depressed because their need for achievement isn't being met. They can't sit back and think, I'm glad I did that. I notice I did this to help my business. So again, this is where it's more important to understand the link with behavior and emotional needs, and how being neurodiverse might get in the way of getting those needs met. So being neurodiverse in and of itself isn't the issue, but aspects of it can get in the way of getting our needs met. Procrastination is a very huge shared experience among many of the people I work with. Procrastination, we know, is avoiding things we need to do, and is emotionally driven. I'm feeling overwhelmed because I don't know how to start the task. I'm feeling anxious because I don't know if I'll do it well enough. And that, interestingly, comes up an awful lot in my work with neurodiverse people.
Absolutely. And that procrastination cycle is really an anxiety response, isn't it? That trying to keep away from the pain of engaging with something when there's all that uncertainty around it, and that build up right until the pain of not doing it eclipses the pain of doing it. And then it's something that we saw an awful lot in higher education was procrastination, and perhaps a higher presentation of that with neurodiverse students. It was interesting you say we don't need a diagnosis to work with it, and actually as therapists and counsellors we can't diagnose anyway, but I saw some really wildly different reactions to a diagnosis. So one of the universities I worked at, we had a large population of mature students. For them coming into education as a mature student, things might be picked up. They might have had a turbulent time within the education system when they were younger. And it might be that they've come to university and things are picked up by a tutor or a lecturer, and they end up in student services and assessed and put through a diagnosis. And on receiving that diagnosis, I saw a few different reactions. One would be a huge amount of relief that makes so much sense of my world, and now I have some structure that I can work to understand that. But I also saw a huge amount of distress in some people, sometimes an anger that perhaps part of their life had been lost or wasted, which could have, might not have happened if they'd had that understanding, decades ago. But also sometimes a distress and confusion about, well, who actually am I now? We talk about masking, and sometimes, you'd see that once people had an understanding that some of the protective behaviors that they've developed were masking. And so now they're not sure of which you are, who am I? And so a real wide range. I'm sure that's something that you come across as well.
Yes, no, and it's lovely that you brought that up. So let's reflect a bit on that. Just to get back to your point about diagnosis, it's not our place to diagnose, it is our place to validate people's feelings. And so I think as therapists or any of us, it's good to have a broader understanding of neurodiversity. And people usually come and say, I think I have ADHD, or I think I'm autistic. There is a huge amount of information on social media. TikTok will lead the way, and Instagram as well. And from my experience, when people say, I think I'm neurodiverse, and I say, please tell me what you've noticed, they're usually spot on. I have yet to meet someone when they think it and it's not, so this is back to self-realization. They're curious about, why am I finding aspects of my life difficult? Or, or someone, now there's more talk about it. People are saying, I think you might have ADHD. A lot of young people I'm working with in their 20s come to me because someone else has mentioned it, and they're looking into it, and they get validation through social media. Parents come to me when their children have been diagnosed. They realize, oh, but everything that applies to my child applies to me. And there is variety in the response to that. So as you said, I'm thinking of one man who got a diagnosis of ADHD and autism, and he had a huge grin on his face. He says, fantastic. He says, I now no longer think anything's wrong with me, because he doesn't see it as anything that's wrong. He has an explanation, and he doesn't see it as an excuse, but it's something he can work with. He can understand, educate himself about it, and work with it, and therefore was more compassionate towards himself. So his whole approach to himself had changed. And as you said, then another lady came to me who had had a late diagnosis of autism in her 50s, and precisely exactly what you said. She looked back at her life thinking, oh, I've been masking all this time. Who am I? And, and yet it was a very simple reframe. I'm amazed at, when I say this to people, you were doing the best that you could with the understanding that you had at the time, and to look back to your younger self in a kind way. Just to put it in context, you couldn't have known. And I said, you're in your 50s. Back then, no one knew. It wasn't talked about. There was such a lack of awareness. So you were doing the best that you could. But it's interesting about the masking, and for people who don't know that term, there's masking, which is watching others and being something that doesn't come intuitively in an effort to fit in. And so often with the diagnosis, you think, well, now I have to be myself. I shouldn't mask. But now how do I fit in? So it actually was, some people have said to me, it was easier before the diagnosis, because by masking, I fitted in. I sometimes talk to people about masking versus adaptation, because all of us have to adapt to the environment. I, as an individual, talk very quickly. I get very energetic, and I talk so fast people can't understand me sometimes. And I have to have that awareness and adapt. So that's not me masking, but simply thinking I need to adapt to my environment just to support the interactions. So there's a difference, I guess, between adaptation, which is self-awareness and adapting to meet those around us, versus masking, which is about putting on this persona, and it's exhausting. People talk about how tiring it is to do this masking. So I guess with our, with with human givens, it's building the rapport, it's the information gathering, and we don't have to be experts. We have to be empathic and understand other people's perception of their world. It's helpful perhaps to know about the characteristics, because often it's reassuring for people to show that it's a shared experience. They're not alone in this. They are a human being, experience something that others also experience. And I think the diagnosis, so we have to be very sensitive to that, what it means to different people, and where it's seen as a negative, it can be a reflection of how it's perceived in society. So the language around neurodiversity does vary. So sometimes I see it talked about as a disability, and for people in the workplace, the formal diagnosis can help because you are protected in the workplace by the Equality Act, and you can reasonably expect your employer to make accommodations to support you in the workplace. And an accommodation might be, if you're dyslexic, that you get speech-to-text software to help you with writing. A reasonable accommodation, if you have ADHD, is to ask for written briefs for your work and not just auditory instructions. And yet the irony is that Equality Act talks about disability. So society then still is positioning it as a negative thing. And yet, so you have to kind of equate that you have something that you don't see as negative, but that's other parts of the society in which you are going to talk about it as a disability.
I think, you all the way through, Karen, you use the most beautiful reframes, and the, reframing self-diagnosis to self-realization, I think is really, really powerful for people.
But one of my clients, sorry to interrupt, but we learn a lot from our clients. That a lovely lady came, and that was her.
And that's her phrase. Yeah, absolutely. And we do, we're always learning. I think I learn from every student I teach and every client I work with. But I think the sort of reframing, you talked about the gentleman who no longer saw himself in that negative way because of the language that you use. And I think we need to be careful that we're not just, building somebody up with sand. We're actually building somebody up with very strong foundations of understanding of the, working with their strengths rather than, compensating for their weaknesses. And so it's that strength-based approach to understanding. And one of the first things you said was, what do you notice that you're good at? What are your strengths? And I think helping people to see that actually some of the things they do, far more effectively than somebody else might do. And I think that goes across the whole board of the human spectrum, doesn't it, really?
Yes, it does. Yeah. But it's a challenging one, Jo, because I had this lovely lady who said to me with her neurodiversity, she says, I can write a novel, and yet when my new puppy pees on the floor, I don't know how to clean it up. Or this lovely lady, she says, I'm really good at my job. A lot of people with ADHD say, I'm great in a crisis. I can really problem solve on the spot. And yet, she says, I can't remember to pick up the prescription from the pharmacy. So there's aspects of day-to-day life that are hard. So as someone said, that ADHD is not a disability, but aspects of it are disabling, that can be disabling in life. It makes aspects of life challenging. And therefore, the other thing is to be strength-based, as you just said. And yet sometimes I do talk about the workarounds with people. And often I divert people to the Facebook groups. There's lots of wonderful Facebook groups for, let's say, ADHD. And I ask my clients, if you go to this, and I recommend some links, and you might say, how does anyone cope with this? You will get a flood of helpful, practical suggestions. And I'll give you an example of, and we as therapists can't think of them all, but I'm just saying there is scope for some practical things for those areas where we're weaker or finding it difficult. So for example, one lady who travels a lot on weekends finds packing really hard because you have to make lots of little decisions, and that's really hard to pack for every weekend. So for her, a workaround was to keep duplicates of everything in the boot of her car, so she can never forget anything. In the boot of her car live the wellies, the extra jackets, everything she needs. So we do need these practical, and we talk about the workarounds. So to accept, but it's always compassion. We're back to acceptance and compassion. I accept this is hard. And so rather than putting our energy into feeling frustrated and fighting against the difficulty, I accept this is hard and direct my energy into problem solving. What's the workaround? And we as therapists might be sounding boards with the workarounds, or we can direct to communities where people can share their respective workarounds, if you will.
Mm. Is there anything in particular, if we're working as a human givens therapist and, we are working with neurodiversity in the room, obviously we're going to be, building the rapport, we're going to be gathering the information to really get into somebody's model of reality and understand, how they're experiencing the world around them. Are there any other practicalities that we can be doing as therapists?
Yes, so I haven't touched on this at all. The huge part that Human Givens offers is, of course, we are so well trained to help people working with anxiety and depression. So what we have is our wonderful psychoeducation to understand why we feel anxious and how to manage anxiety, because nearly everyone who's neurodiverse does experience anxiety regularly or at some point. So that, and often that has, the GP has diagnosed depression and anxiety and overlooked the neurodiverse piece. That's a very common experience. So I would suggest that everyone needs that understanding of psychoeducation and how to manage the anxious response. Another typical experience is the ability to process our emotions. And that, funnily enough, is a characteristic associated with neurodiversity. We are emotional beings, but the intensity of emotion and that being able to process emotion is an important thing that we can share with our clients. And that's actually the starting point for nearly all the work I do with neurodiverse people, is emotion regulation. And they will bring that up: quick to anger, quickly irritated, feeling anxious, that whole breadth. So we have a lot to support people there with that really important bread and butter thing, I think, that whole understanding of, so we have ADHD on the one hand is understanding cognitive style. Against that is the psychoeducation, our lovely emotional brain, our amygdala, working with our nervous system to shift from fight-flight response to a more relaxed response. And of course, our emotional needs model, always to understand how well people's emotional needs are being met. So fundamental. So to understand their mood. And so there's so much that we can offer, I think, through our Human Givens training. And just that brings to mind another thing. It's interesting, neurodiverse people often have an intuitive way of thinking is very much black and white thinking, very much all or nothing thinking. And yet we also know when we're anxious, that distorts our thought processes. So often I find with my clients, this tendency to black and white thinking comes from the cognitive style and also from their emotional status of feeling anxious. So there's often a lot of work to do around managing emotion and, of course, our thought processes. And in particular, I find black and white thinking styles. And I talk about, this is another thing that comes up a lot, introducing psychological flexibility. And that's a theme. I just worked with someone earlier this morning, and she notices she's so set in her thinking, and that if the routine for the evening, if dinner is set back by half an hour, this upsets her evening, and how to develop flexibility. And that's a wonderful life skill as well, in fact. So, and we can do a lot there. I mean, I think I have to say, I think the Human Givens training is tremendous. It equips us very well to work with neurodiverse people.
I absolutely agree. I'm really intrigued by the psychological flexibility. So how can you give us some examples of how you might help somebody to become more psychologically flexible?
Yes. So I was working with a young man who has a diagnosis of autism, and he's a student. He holds a job. He's in a relationship, a loving relationship, and one way he looks at things is always to compare. So he might have a good night out, but he's always comparing it to the best night out. And this was then, in a way, by his own admission, nothing was ever good enough because he's always comparing it to some other standard. And yet he and I meet in person, and when I meet people in person, I tend to draw things out. I have a whole cup of felt tip pens and paper, and then we were looking at how things stand on their own right. So not to make the comparison, so to drop that and to look at things differently. Usually we draw out how he looks at it and how you might look at it differently. So that's the psychological flexibility. So, and often we, you know how based on our experience, we tend to create our lens with which we view the world. And so to make him familiar with the lens based on his life experience so far, or how we can change the lens, we can rub the lens and look at things a bit differently. And he said that's one of the biggest benefits of our work together so far. He enjoys that he can look at things differently, and that's really liberating, in fact, because it opens up possibilities.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you've talked about working from a very behavioural point of view and a cognitive point of view, and also from an emotional and psychological point of view as well. So we're going down, we're ticking all the, the boxes of how we are as a human being, aren't we? There.
But you're right. So now we've talked about cognitive, but as we know through our human givens training, so much is also in the body, so that how much is cognitive, and a huge component of our work, of course, is relaxation techniques and guided visualization, rehearsal, generating a reality through a guided visualization so that people already can experience change or imagine what things can be like. And so I'm glad that you kind of led us to think about this other huge important thing that we can offer to our clients. And it's interesting, just as a very kind of small anecdote, but it made a lot to this particular client. He struggles with the laundry. Everyday things like laundry are huge in for people. And for people with ADHD, laundry is a real touching point, sticking point, both in their relationships or even when they live alone, and in relationships because they're not doing their fair share. Because laundry, when you think about it, is a linear sequential process. You have to be able to hold a sequence of how one thing follows another. You have to also have a sense of time. You have to also, it's actually very boring by its nature. So most of us, perhaps who are less neurodiverse, might just think, this is boring, I'll do it as quickly as possible. But for some people with ADHD, out of sight, out of mind, the laundry might stay in the washing machine forever, or the dry clothes might stay in the basket forever. So with one gentleman, I'll give you two examples that just show how we can work with this. So for one gentleman, he just was procrastinating, not doing it, doing the laundry, getting it out of the basket and folding it away. So there we did a guided visualization. So it was to generate ideas. We talked about it. Now he was imagining this new process of how to make it more interesting and where he does it. And as the guided visualization came to an end and I asked him to reflect on it, he said that was so helpful, because when I was imagining the process for doing the laundry, I realized there was a barrier to doing it. There wasn't enough room in the place I was doing it, but he kind of had come up with a workaround during the visualization. And he said, after that, I went off and did it. I have this whole new process. So the visualization there was problem solving for him as well as a practice. Having pictured it, he knew he could do it. So that shows you the power of that kind of reality.
That positive use of imagination, because as all humans, we can negatively rehearse things in our minds, and being able to have a positive rehearsal, to lay down a map to follow, really, which is what you're doing in that, has obviously been hugely beneficial, certainly to that gentleman there. And I just wondered, I was talking to a student a while back, and they were saying about the actual structure of a therapy session. And for them, it was more helpful if a therapy session was a little bit shorter, if we went into a different room sometimes. In the university, they found that very uncomfortable. So that regularity, that familiarity to this particular student was really important. And the fact that, they wanted to sit in a particular chair. So I think, considering all of those different aspects as well can be important, can't it?
Yes. Well, so a lot of neurodiverse people may have sensory issues. So the light, the sound and the environment. So that's important to understand. It's interesting. So quite a lot of what I do is online. So I guess then the client can pick the environment in which they're doing this. And yet I notice what I need to be more mindful of is also the regularity of the sessions. So for some clients, it might be a different day, different time from week to week, depending on their work schedules. And yet some people might like that constant same time, same week. So to be mindful, to be sensitive to that aspect. So I guess it's if we don't know, then it's being so collaborative with our clients and understanding from them what's going to be most helpful. Would you like something the same? And usually that's part of our approach as counselors, that we do collaborate with them. I would suggest another thing though is, because of the, if you're doing online therapy, because of the auditory nature of it, I often will say to my clients now, and often before, saying, have pen and paper ready, take notes, or when we're having an idea, stop, write that down. So that not after the therapy session you think, well, that was great, that was helpful, but there's no visual reminder, because don't forget, we're working with people with and I will do follow-up emails where I might say, here are the key points. Or I will often go to Instagram, because there's so much good material, and send pictures to people. You know, if we talk about the grounding or any of the strategies we talk about, I will usually try and find a picture and use WhatsApp to share pictures of that and ask them to create visual reminders. So we do need to think about that aspect of it as well.
So obviously putting lots of different things, and I love that the collaborative nature of the piece of work, and Gareth and I talk about the, you know, where a client-led therapy session, what that might look like, and a counsellor-led therapy session, what that might look like. But what we're doing in Human Givens is we're co-creating that session, aren't we? And it is a very collaborative approach. And part of your strategy, you know, you've talked about a number of different things, but obviously addressing the emotional needs, looking at what barriers there are, what resources they've got to be able to help them to meet those needs. But, you know, I think we need to not overlook the importance, whoever we are, of those physical needs as well. So educating around how improving our sleep can help us with some of these things, and, you know, having a balanced, healthy diet, the importance of sunlight and things, which sometimes if people are feeling highly anxious, those things can go out of the window, can't they?
Oh, this is so much to think about now that we're going into it. And it's interesting, if we go bringing back to our topic of neurodiversity, and I think the focus has been in particular on ADHD, hydration is a huge thing. So people forget. So a lot of routine things. This lovely lady with ADHD has a hydration app to remind her to drink enough during the day. So these things, again, unless you have water in front of you, at the whole out of sight, out of mind, eating can become problematic, because so someone might hyper-focus, work for hours, and then by the time it comes, it's too effortful to think about what to make, because it's, again, a sequence of activity. And so it's not unusual for people with ADHD to eat the same meal every day. So I had one lovely young lady, and her pad thai noodles was her thing day after day. But that was better to have something that she can do easily, the path of least resistance, than all the planning. There's a lot of executive functioning skills involved in meal planning and preparation, and then getting to eat. And some of the skills involved in these things are very challenging. So we are looking to the path of least resistance. And there's a dietitian I follow on Instagram, and it's all about hacks, how to have eat well with ADHD, but with minimum effort. So we do need lots of compassion, and just realize that, and we haven't even touched on it yet, which is this whole executive functioning piece. That's what it's called, executive functioning, which is those life skills for day-to-day life, which includes nutrition, hydration. Sleep is a huge problem. So when I work with people with ADHD, it's getting to sleep, or when they get to sleep, it's the waking up again. So that in itself is a whole other area to understand. And actually, again, we're there to help. A lot of people quickly flag up their sleep issues, but there's always this overlying thing about anxiety. So actually, the work we can do around anxiety, I'm anxious because I'm not sleeping well. So there's always anxiety about the things that aren't happening or that are difficult. And that's what we have to manage so carefully, and we do a lot of work around that.
Absolutely. And of course, if they're not sleeping well, the anxiety is going to be worse.
And then we have the distorted thoughts, then we're sabotaging ourselves. And a lot of the clients I work with talk about, there's spirals of rumination. So there's a lot of work to help there around distorted thinking and back to acceptance and compassion. So I do think we cover a lot in the Human Givens training. And I guess my message to individual therapists listening to this is become familiar with the characteristics. You do not need to be an expert, but just know what to expect and know what to ask. So the people who come to you do need validation. Oh, you know, I think I'm autistic, and my mother said absolutely not. Tell me why you think you're autistic. What does that mean to you? What does that look like? What would you, you know, so we just need to know how to question and I guess, and validation. People want to feel heard and understood, and that, I think, is our job, isn't it?
Absolutely. And really having a solid understanding of all the tools that we have in our Human Givens toolbox, and when to use the right tool, you know, for the right job. And we can only do that by, as you say, really listening and really understanding, because we do have those tools there already.
Yes. So don't let a lack of experience with neurodiversity put you off too quickly. You know, I think we are well equipped, but there might just be, you know, just, you know, being open-minded and just keeping, you know, there's lots of information out there, so one could read around and also then, you know, listen to your clients.
Wonderful. Karen, thank you so much. I think, as you say, we could have done so many different standalone podcasts with the different topics that have come up today, but I really do appreciate the time that you've given us, and the, you know, the really valuable information and knowledge that you've shared on your own experiences of working with neurodiverse people, and obviously through the Human Givens model as well. And I'm sure our listeners have found it hugely helpful, whether that be from a personal or professional point of view, or maybe even both. So if you, as our listeners, would like to explore the Human Givens approach and the training we offer, you can find out more by visiting our website, and you can find the link for that in the podcast description. They'll also be able to find the links to the resources mentioned in this podcast, as well as Karen's own therapist profile. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, Jo, and I hope that we can all learn and grow together in supporting each other.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you.